We go in 10. Well, may you live in interesting times. There is a debate about the origin of that phrase. It has long been thought to be a Chinese curse, but we can all agree on this, that when it comes to the question of housing in BC, these are very interesting times indeed.
Good evening, I'm Fairchild Radio host Trevina Lee。歡迎大家參加加拿大中文電台同 CBC 電台合辦嘅房屋論壇。
And I'm Stephen Quinn, the host of the early edition on CBC Radio 1. Welcome to a special live CBC British Columbia forum on housing from Richmond, BC tonight. We have teamed up with Fairchild Radio to bring tonight's town hall from the Brighouse United Church. And at issue, is housing a commodity or is it a human right? Or is it both or somewhere in between? We're going to get straight to our audience in just a moment, but first, we'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather tonight is the unceded ancestral territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam and Tsawwassen. Now, we have on hand tonight a whole lot of smart people who know a lot about housing. They are up here on the altar of this beautiful, if slightly down on its luck, church. More about that in a moment. We've invited them here to help inform tonight's discussion. We also have a packed house this evening, and we do appreciate your questions and look forward to them all. So let's get to it. With our very first of three panels this evening. Panelists, I'm going to ask you first to introduce yourself and tell us where you stand on the question, is housing a commodity, or is it a human right, or is it something in between?
So my name is Mark Ting. I'm the financial columnist with On the Coast, CBC. And we discuss real estate, mortgages, everything in between on a regular basis. I'm also a Richmond resident. I grew up here and I've lived here for 40 years. In terms of the question, I don't see real estate as a commodity. I do see it as an investment. I've invested quite a bit in real estate myself. I own a home. I've also have some revenue properties, and I've actually been a foreign investor as well. In terms of whether it's a human right, that's an interesting question in that I would love to see it as sort of a basic right as we would see for like education. I'm just not exactly sure how that's come to be, who's responsible for providing that right. So that I'm actually looking forward to listening to everybody else on the panel.
All right. Thank you, Mark.
I'm Tsur Somerville. I'm a professor at the Sauder School of Business, UBC, and an economist by training. And to answer Stephen's question, I'd say it's actually both, and they needn't be mutually exclusive. But how you resolve them and how you work with them is a challenge, and that's where we tend to run into problems.
All right. Thank you, sir.
My name is Patsy Huey. I've been living in Richmond for over 44 years, and been a realtor for 34, and I believe, and I strongly actually believe in real estate is, like housing is an investment first, but then human rights, we should have housing. In what form of housing, I think is how you do in the world and how the world sees you, whether you need help, and I think the general public should do that. I must emphasize that I should be qualified to say that because I actually found out that since 1977, since the Real Estate Board of Greater Vancouver kept track of, average pricing, from 1977 to April 2018, just a few days ago, our compounded rate of increase in value is, anybody want to guess that? 7.72% compounded rate. And then since 2001, May the 15th, it is 7.97. So I just want people to remember those figures. And housing as human rights is to me, I totally believe in it because I work in a lot of charity work, and I totally understand that.
Thank you, Patsy.
Hi, my name is Justin Fung. I'm a software development manager by day. By night, I guess, on social media, I'm also a housing activist with the group Housing Action for Local Taxpayers. I think that housing can be both, although I would say that we need to shift it further back towards it being a human right. I think we've seen an extraordinary commodification of housing here in Vancouver, in Greater Vancouver. That's causing a lot of crisis, causing a lot of grief for everyday citizens. And I think it's something that we need to do. There's something we need to do about it. It is something we need a national housing strategy. We need better federal and provincial governments and municipal governments to be stepping up and recognizing the plight that people have. I think that we think about the human needs, like Maslow's needs, the hierarchy of needs. Shelter is one it's right up there. It's very high. And we think about things like financial security. Housing is one of the things that has an outsized impact on your financial security. So I think these are things that we do need to take into account. I think that right now we do need to swing things back more towards a human right.
Well, thank you to all four of our panelists for those thoughtful answers, and we will be throwing all sorts of questions at you this evening. We're going to begin by going straight to the floor, and a question from the audience, if you could state your name and your question.
Sure. Good evening, Stephen. Good evening, panelists. My name is Wei Qiao Zhang. I'm a new immigrant, arrived in Canada 15 years ago from mainland China. I'm also a Canadian citizen and served the communities in the last 10 years. My question is, as we witness our city receive a large influx of immigrants in the last few years, that caused a lot of change in demographic. So my question is, how can we best utilize the knowledge and the skills of those new immigrants and turn them into our strengths as a society? Mm. And also the second part of the question I think is related is, how can we maybe look further and learn something from Asian cities who are doing better in terms of coping with change with regards to building infrastructures as well as policy changes. So those are my questions. I hope it will set a good tone for the conversation.
Thank you very much, and we'll put those to the panel. The first part of that question, what can we learn from recent arrivals from Asia who make the Lower Mainland their home? Does anyone want to tackle that one right off the top? Mark.
I think mostly from Asian countries or sort of countries with a long history that have been longer than our own. What we see there is they got a lot more density. Mm-hmm. Like it is very, very normal for people, families to live in 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, and big towers. It is unusual actually for these families to live in single family homes. So I think we're becoming those types of densities. We're becoming those types of community as more and more immigrants come here. So I think it needs to be a bit of a change and shift in focus. Like that dream of having that single family home probably needs to go away. Like when I talk to my kids about their future and whether they're gonna have a single family home, I pretty much crush that dream. I tell them the likelihood is you probably won't. You won't be able to afford it. We don't have enough land, but that's okay because everybody around the world, lots of other places, they live in these more compact type living spaces and they're perfectly fine and they're perfectly happy.
Patsy Huey, as a realtor, do you crush that dream often by telling people that they're not going to be able to afford a single family home with a big backyard?
Basically, if you just look at what happened recently with the gas, don't you find 1,419 is really cheap now? And it's only a couple of months ago, it's 1,299 was cheap. People are very adaptable. I'm so totally surprised with that. And kids these days, which I see a lot, this is my good friend's, son. Like that generation these days, they don't want a house. Like they really, most of them don't. They just want to have an apartment, townhouse. Like you have to be in the field to feel that because we want them to have a home. They don't want a home. They don't want to look after a home.
Let's ask the person you're pointing to there, Justin. Justin, would you like a house?
I would like a sufficiently large enough space to grow my family. Today I live in a townhouse. I rent a townhouse. I've previously owned a condo. And in a lot of cases, it's and I was fortunate to get into the market 7-8 years ago. If let's talk a little bit about people and buying their first home today. If you look at in Richmond here today, we're looking at about $1,000 a square foot for a new condo. If you look at the new mortgage rules that have come into place in terms of stress tests, someone earning a median salary in the city would be hard pressed to be able to afford even a 1-bedroom condo at $400,000, $450,000. And we're talking about studio space that has 1 bedroom. You add a crying baby in there, and all of a sudden now you've got to move up into 2 bedrooms. And that leap becomes incredibly difficult. And again, I talked a little bit about the financial insecurity. Without getting outside help, without overstretching yourself, you put yourself into this position where it becomes very, very stressful to to get into that home. So, I think we've been asked to change our expectations, and I think in a lot of cases we have. But I think that change has been so drastic all of a sudden, and with the price increases that have come through, it started to put a lot of stress on a lot of these young families.
And Sir Somerville, what do we have to learn from what we've seen in larger cities in Asia, Singapore, for instance?
Well, the thing is that the different countries in Asia and the different cities have very, very different experiences and different things to teach us. If you look at expensive cities like Singapore and Hong Kong, you're looking at cities that functionally have very, very large public housing sectors. It's not explicitly referred to that way in Singapore, but it de facto is. The 1/3 approximately of people who rent in Hong Kong are renting mostly in public housing. But on the negative side, if you look at the People's Republic of China, you want to talk about commoditization of housing. Excess investment in real estate, especially residential real estate, there is what leads to ghost cities. So you get a lot of different things, and even in the single-family housing is still something that exists in Asia, particularly if you look at Japan. But it's very, very dense. The footprint of the individual house is very, very small, and they're very, very sort of close together. So you take one of our lots and you put 4 houses on it. Right. So there are different things that you can learn in different kinds of ways from Asia. But I wouldn't paint it in any kind of single brush because it's so diverse.
Michelle Elliott is standing by, and she is, of course, the host of BC Today, which is a province-wide show that you hear at noontime every day. And Michelle, who have you got with you there?
Yes, Stephen, I'm here with Stuart Appenheimer, who is the pastor here at Brighouse United Church, the church that we're standing in. And Stuart, good evening.
Good evening.
Thanks for having us. You have been worshiping here for 30 years, but you've made a really interesting decision, and that is to develop this church. What led to that decision?
Well, for the past approximately 12 years, we've been looking at our buildings, which are aging quickly and need lots of repairs, and trying to figure out how we can handle that. And also, around that time, we began to have pretty significant concern for homeless people and for people who are kind of living on the edge financially. We help out a lot of people now. We've helped prevent people from being evicted from their places or to get their power back on so they could have heat. And we help out with food and various other things. So we know there's great needs out there. So we began to think about the possibility of affordable housing. And we came close to going ahead with things a few times. But for example, the best we could do was 5% of the units would be affordable housing. And the idea is that we would use the value of the property to be able to develop housing and a new church facility. And the proposal now is that our church facility would be about 10,000 square feet, which is 3,000 or 4,000 less than we have now. And the latest thing is that we are able to, with the help of a new program from BC Housing and the United Church of Canada and BC, provide 50% of 164 units of rental housing as affordable workforce housing. So when I heard that, I just thought, wow, this will be a blessing to the community and to the church, and it's a wonderful thing to be able to offer.
And that makes you now both a pastor and a developer, in fact. So when you think about the question we're discussing here tonight, which is housing an investment or a human right, where do you stand on that?
First, I want to let you know that I am not a developer, and that we have good people working for us. And actually, the United Church's new housing society, 3 Point Housing, is the developer. And I think that housing is a basic human need, and everyone deserves the opportunity to have a safe and warm or cool or whatever place to live. So I think that should be our goal. I admit I'm approaching a retirement age. I don't know if I'll keep on working or not. And it's true, our house that my wife and I own is an investment that we hope to gain from, but that wasn't why we bought a house when we first came to Richmond 30 years ago. It was so that we would have a place to live and raise our children. And we thought, coming from Saskatchewan, that prices here were crazy then, but they got crazier.
that they did. Stuart, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thanks for being here.
That's Stuart Appenheimer, who is the pastor, just the pastor, here at Brighouse United Church.
All right. Michelle Elliott, thank you so much. Michelle Elliott, the host of BC Today on CBC Radio 1 right across British Columbia. We have another question from the audience. Good evening to you.
Okay. Good evening. Jimmy N here. And my question is, I did not find housing as a right on Charter or the BC Human Rights Code. And however, can you tell me, identify where exactly do you find housing as a right in Canada? Thank you.
All right. I will leave it to the panel. You will not find housing in the BC Charter. You will not find it in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I take it that that person thinks that perhaps housing is not a human right because it is not enshrined as such. Sir, you want to tackle that one?
All right. Well, I find it in my heart. So I think that from a purely ethical, at least for me, point of view, you know, society, as a society, particularly as a wealthy society, we have a responsibility to ensure that people have a certain, you know, basic standard, and that includes food, that includes shelter, and those are the places certainly that you start. Companionship, obviously, is a little more difficult and challenging to provide, and I just don't see, given the wealth that we have, that there's any reason why we can't do more to ensure that people have housing. Now, how you deliver it and the mechanisms, that becomes more challenging. And I think the other thing that becomes challenging is that so many of us look at our house as our purely private space. And the reality is what I do on land affects the people around me. It's a constrained environment, and there's fundamentally a public interest in everybody's individual piece of property. And one of the challenges I think we find ourselves in is reconciling that public interest with the private desires and private objectives.
Patsy, would you like to tackle that one?
Definitely from the heart, and that's what God taught us to do, like to share and to look after each other and love each other. I think that's so important, a fundamental thing to understand. And the government and the public should work together to get things done together. I think that's definitely a cooperation, and not just I demand housing, but we have to talk and dialogue, you know, and etc.
We tend, Martin, not to talk about housing, though, you know, in those terms. I mean, I take the point that the person asking the question is trying to make. Where do you think government involvement belongs when it comes to guaranteeing housing for people?
Yeah, I think Justin Trudeau recently said that it was a human right, but he didn't go as far as saying that we're going to supply housing for absolutely everything. And that's where I sort of come to think about it, is like, if I have a son or a daughter, which I do, and they're 19 and all of a sudden they leave, whose responsibility is it for them to have housing? Is it the government's or is it mine? So I imagine in my mind, if I have the resources, I should try to help out my kids because they're my responsibilities. But you know, to be completely honest, if we had 1,000 homeless people here in Richmond, and it wasn't an issue. We had unlimited funds. We had neighborhoods which were accepting, and the homeless people wanted to live here. Even if we built that, I imagine over the next couple of years, we'd still have a homeless problem. It's kind of one of those things, if you build it, they will come, and there's always going to be that. So it's a bit of a cynic in me that every society has always had homelessness, but I don't think that we just give up on it. I think we should definitely put strides, and we should put programs together to help the homeless, as well as just housing in general. Justin, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think ultimately the fact that we don't have it enshrined in our Charter of Human Rights, and as the BC Human Rights Tribunal to not have it there is something that we need to be fighting for as citizens, as activists. You know, I think I've gotten involved because, you know, in my capacity, sort of in the middle income and middle income folks that are affected by the housing crisis, and what it's led me to do is meet with a lot of people who have been advocating for social housing for a very long time. We need to be thinking a lot more about, as you talk about mechanisms, sir, is not-for-profit. You have co-op housing, you have land trust, community land trust. We need to be looking into those options that are non-market, because every time we build a luxury condo, the opportunity cost of that in terms of the land, in terms of what we do with it, is that that can be opportunity for non-market solutions as well. So I think it pushes up the cost of social housing every time this crisis drives luxury condos higher and higher that we're selling offshore. I think that is making it more difficult for us to house everybody.
Thanks, Justin.
Just throw one thing in, which is I think it strikes me that there's often this confusion that human right equals free. And I don't think that necessarily has to be the case, right? And so, the human right part is guaranteeing the ability to access something in a way that is reasonable and fair. Now, for some people, that may well be free because their incomes are so low, but it's not, free equals a human right.
All right, good point to make. Thank you, Tsur. We have Michelle Elliott at the microphone, and Michelle's got a question from Facebook.
We have a question, in fact, from here in the audience. I think this whole discussion has sparked some conversation, and this comment now from someone here in the audience who says, housing is a right. United Nations, Canada, at the United Nations level, Canada is a signatory to this. The NDP's Bob Rae advocated for a social contract, and Ontario's Ministry of Housing is expected to submit a report on housing as a right, and this commenter suggests we interview Bob Rae and educate ourselves.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate that. We've got Trevina Lee standing by from Fairchild Radio, and we are co-hosting this, of course, with Fairchild Radio tonight, and Trevina's got a question from Facebook.
Yeah, I got a Roy Mulder. He asked on Facebook, he wants to know how do we address the reasons the market got this way in the first place, like shadow flipping.
Well, there's a question. Contract assignment, shadow flipping, pre-sale flipping, and so on. How do we begin to get at what brought us to where we are today? Mark Ting.
Well, they are sort of doing that. Like a couple years ago, maybe just a year ago, the CRA came down on a lot of developers and basically said, open up your books. Otherwise, we're going to take you to court. Because essentially what happens is a house could be flipped many times, and then it's only the last person who actually takes possession of it, puts their name down, and there's a lot of transactions that were happening in the past, and all that stuff happened essentially tax-free. And a lot of people were saying that was overseas, and even if CRA came down on them, well, they're overseas, so they wouldn't have too much of a great chance of actually collecting on that. So now, from what I understand, these developers now have to open up their books. It's sort of it's the developer's responsibility to actually declare, they call it transparency, of who is shadow flipping.
Tsur, has that ship sailed, though? I've seen a lot of horses leaving barns on social media this week.
Well, I think the whole shadow flipping thing is a complete red herring. That the reason that you get a lot of flipping of pre-sale contracts is because prices are going up dramatically, and so it's something that follows the price appreciation. So I think the more fundamental question is what are the fundamentals in the capital flows that are causing house appreciation? And there's clearly an inflow of capital, but there's also an inflow of people. We also have a lot of millennials, and so there's sort of piece of the population that, in terms of household formation and moving into home ownership, is growing, and those demand pieces in a supply-constrained environment, both because of land, so it's God's fault, and because of regulation, means that the market responses are not there in the way that they might be in other kinds of places.
All right. Would anyone else like to add anything on that? Justin?
I'd like to sort of dispute the supply constraint part of it. I think we've built plenty of luxury condos that, again, are marketed offshore. I think that we do have this difficulty, and I think if you talk about shadow flipping and how we came about to even understand how this came about, it was investigative journalists, it was the media that brought this to light, and had it not been for them, we would still be in the dark on this. So I do think that that's a really crucial piece of the puzzle. I do think that we have industries, and Patsy, you're probably going to disagree with me on this, but the real estate council, they've been self-regulated, and this is the biggest purchase you'll make in your lifetime. It's the most stressful thing I've ever done in my life was buying a condo, and it's entirely self-regulated to the point where and when people do make off and do wrong things. They get a slap on the wrist because it's self-regulated. They do not want to open that up. And if you think about, if we're talking about housing as investments, then we should regulate in the same way as investments. You should put it through, you should have the same oversight. And we don't have that. And ultimately, we've relied on our journalists to give us that. And
Patsy, you are here nodding in agreement by the looks of it as a realtor yourself. Do you welcome more regulation?
Okay. We always need it. because I totally agree with the shadow flipping, that's nobody's paying tax somewhere else or even locally.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of people think it's all foreign. It's not. So, and it's not recently. It's always there. You know, but guess what? Supply and demand dictates pricing, and guess what's going to happen coming up? You guys probably guessed it already and realized it already. We had double-digit sales in housing in Richmond and Vancouver West. And believe me, a home in Southland sold for $13.85 million. The last one was sold for 40-some-odd years old, sold for 16.7 only in July last year. And recently, this last week, one sold for 13.85, which is 10 years old. Not a Chinese home, Canadian home. Okay, so Canadian bought it so it's coming. The bubble has burst. It will come down, and we will work with government, we'll work with everybody, always, you know, to provide, you know, affordable housing, to look after everybody.
I want to get to an audience question in a moment. Just hold on one second if we can. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about efforts to cool down the market, and what if they work too well, and how big a risk is the loss of the equity that people already have in their homes? That's something our former premier was very worried about. Mark Ting.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about affordability, I don't think they've worked at all. Because if I'm looking at it from a first-time home buyer, think of it, all the buyers are in a pool, and because of the stress test, various other reasons, they can no longer afford these higher-end stuff. The foreign capital is completely dried up, which a lot of people have. So we've seen a decline in single-family homes on the high end for about a year and a half now, and they're dropping significantly. Like $1 million drop is not surprising. And now everyone's swimming in the shallow end. So prices on the shallow end, where millennials and whatever are trying to buy, they're competing with speculators, because that's where the hot money is. That's where the flipping is right now. They're competing with people who have been pushed down into that level because of the stress tests. So it's being worse than ever. And there was a report from RBC that basically said, they put it out there, big bold lines, is in terms of affordability, it's never been as bad as it is right now. So
when we look at that relationship between the very, very expensive homes and how they relate to the rest of the market, they obviously are related.
Well, even if you're, because I know a lot of people who their plan was to sell out. So these are people who own homes, sell out their house and retire, and that's what they're going to use for retirement. They were also going to take a good chunk of that money and give it to their kids as a down payment. But now, because prices have gone down, they can pick one or the other. They can retire and live off of it, or they can help their kids out, and they're also competing for these condos and things that everyone else is going for.
I want to get back to the microphones in our audience here this evening. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi, my name is Paul. My comments and question may be made more relevant by the fact that I grew up in Winnipeg, which is a very different city than what we live in out here on the West Coast. Language that's used to describe the real estate market in Winnipeg doesn't even compare to how people talk about assets and investments and everything under the sun. And so, you know, one thing, Stephen, which I really appreciate about your work on this podcast was some of your references to our prior history with corruption and fraud in our stock markets and whatnot, and how the coast here has been a hotbed of this activity for decades. And I think that if anything may come of this crisis that we're all having conversations about, is how we reconcile those tendencies in our culture in British Columbia, in the Lower Mainland specifically, that endears itself to go along and participate with fraud and corruption. And for 40 years it existed in the stock market. We were globally recognized for this issue. And I think that Vancouver is one of maybe 5 global cities where these tendencies have exerted themselves. And I think that it ultimately vests with the politicians. And and I want to know actually, sort of like, why isn't British Columbia confident in its ability to actually build a real economy based on real labor without having to rely on these tendencies?
All right, good question. Thank you very much. Sure. Pardon me?
Apparently I'm now the premier of British Columbia. You know, I mean, I think at the root of that question is a problem that we face, which is because of the real estate boom. You know, real estate is a larger piece of our economy in terms of the whole chain than you find certainly elsewhere in Canada, and in ways that look a lot more like Dubai than perhaps where we actually want to be. And that's one of the things I think that's very much not healthy about the current situation. There's no way that having any kind of asset have sort of 30% price appreciation on an annual basis over the last couple of years is a good thing, and particularly with housing. I think a lot of the conversation that we're having here, though, is an artifact of a very, very recent phenomenon that we've had, and then if you think in the longer term, we've had periods of rapid price appreciation. When you had the doubling of immigration in the late 80s with people moving from Hong Kong and coming with capital and coming with wealth, that was a period where we saw a lot of price appreciation, and then it was essentially flat for 7 or 8 years or declining slightly. So there is this pattern of sort of cyclicality at work, and it's probably not too good to completely flip out on things that are happening right now.
We are going to talk a lot more about this throughout the evening. We've got at least an hour left to go. You're listening to a special live broadcast on CBC Radio 1. Along with Fairchild Radio, we are broadcasting to you from Brighouse United Church in Richmond, BC, and we are talking about housing and whether housing is a human right or a commodity to be traded and bought and sold. Much more coming up. I'd like to thank our panelists who have been with us this evening as well. We've got a packed house and a studio audience here. We'll be taking many more questions from you. We're going to take a break for the news at the top of the hour. Do stay with us. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention for a moment, please. We're about 2 minutes away from coming back on the air at 8:05. And if I could have everyone take their seats. We know there are a lot of questions from the audience this evening. We are going to try to plow through as many of them as we can. And we'll introduce you to our new panel in just a moment up here. Once again, just a little bit less than 2 minutes to go before we come back on the air. Thank you all so much, and thank you for being here. Thank you for the questions, and thanks to Fairchild Radio and Trevina Lee as well for being with us here this evening. We appreciate it. And we're waiting for theme. Theme. Trevina, you're going to hear the theme come up, and then I'll just cue you, okay? And you can do it. 30 seconds, folks. Thank you. Good evening. I'm Stephen Quinn at Brighouse United Church in Richmond, along with Trevina Lee from Fairchild Radio. With Trevina, we just got your mic open. We tried to introduce you, but could you do that again, please?
Sure, I'm Fairchild Radio host Trevina Lee. 歡迎大家嚟到我哋加拿大中文電台同 CBC 電台合辦嘅房屋論壇。
Thank you so much, Trevina. We have teamed up with Fairchild Radio to bring you tonight's Housing Town Hall from Brighouse United Church in Richmond. We are live across BC on CBC Radio 1 right now. We're also on the CBC Radio app, and we're on Facebook, and we are streaming this in Cantonese and Mandarin tonight as well. We have had an intense half hour of conversation to start things off. We're going to move on to a new panel, and I would like to ask the members of the panel just to introduce themselves. And I do have one question for each of you, the same question for each of you. After you introduce yourself, try this one briefly. What do you make of the measures that we have seen so far to address affordability in real estate in this province and to try to rein in the real estate sector?
Hi, thank you, Stephen. My name is Erin Seeley. I'm the Executive Officer of the Real Estate Council of British Columbia. We are the Crown agency responsible for consumer protection and licensing of real estate professionals, including those who support consumers to buy and sell, as well as rental and strata managers. And while I can't speak to the government's policy changes or some of the recent initiatives about the wider impacts on the housing market, I can say that from the regulator's perspective, what happened in 2016 was we changed from self-regulation to being a government-appointed board with public accountability, government accountability, to work to make sure the housing market is fair. So regardless of the prices and the changes in the supply and the demand, it's important that consumers are informed and feel protected, that when they make purchase and rental and strata decisions, they get good advice and they understand the risks in the market.
Thank you, Aaron.
Hi, I'm Tom Davidoff, like Source Somerville. I'm an economist and a associate professor at the Sauder School of Business, UBC. Since I got to Canada in 2009, I've noticed in terms of unaffordable housing, we've got crazy zoning where we restrict development on extremely expensive land to single-family homes. We're starting to see municipalities improve on that, sell their zoning to developers, which I think is great. The other thing we've done for a long time is told the world, come buy our real estate and we're going to charge you really low property taxes, but don't try to make a living because we're going to hit you with income and sales taxes that are very high. That was really bad policy, mission accomplished. We've got some of the worst affordability in the world, but we're really seeing that change with the speculation tax, empty homes tax surcharge on very expensive homes. We're shifting the tax burden, hopefully away from working for a living and towards owning real estate, which when you can't build, property taxes don't hurt much. So I'm very pleased with where they're going.
All right.
Hi, Stephen. Hi, audience. My name is Tung Chan, and I've been a Richmond resident for 43 years actually. I was a retired I'm a retired banker, and I was the CEO of Success, and last but not least, I was a councillor of City of Vancouver from 1990 to 1993. But before I go on answering your question, Stephen, I want to say thank you to you, to CBC, and to Fairchild Radio for organizing this forum, because I think it's so important that in this day and age, when we have two solitudes of communities, the English-speaking community and the Chinese-speaking community, that we have a forum to exchange ideas, to have an open dialogue, and talk about common things. So thank you. In terms of your question, whether the government responds to those taxes that Professor here mentioned, I would say this. I think it is a very good political response. It takes the focus away from the politicians who have been in inaction and haven't done enough in the past 30, 40 years. But as far as whether this is a good policy response, it's totally off the mark. You heard from the last panel that if our goal, our policy goal, is to create affordable housing, the empty home tax, the speculative tax, it's not going to add a single unit of affordable housing to this market. What they do really need to do is to make sure the zoning is right. When I was a councillor from 1990-93, we rezoned downtown south, changed 1.3 million square feet of office zoning into residential zoning. We rezoned the Fraser land and create a lot of high-rises. This is the kind of things we do. We have many industrial zone land. Why don't we look at it and rezone it into residential zoning? We got to do some bold, active, creative ideas to make sure that we have affordable housing.
Thank you, Tung Chan. And as I said, we'll try to devote as much of the remainder of our time to questions from our audience this evening. And please go ahead.
Yes, hello. My name's John Reichman. I think that the response from the government at this point has been dreadful. I don't think it's going the right direction at all. There's no consideration for the actual debt against the home. It's an assessed value. Small business operators in British Columbia use the equity in their home to finance their business, to finance growth, to create jobs. The idea that the government should just come in and confiscate their equity is a dangerous precedent. It's a very bad direction to go in. I think that some of the taxes that are targeted specifically at speculation make sense, but this direction seems terrible to me.
And just to be clear, you're talking about the surtax on homes valued at more than $3 million,
yes,
and then again $4 million, so two tiers.
The so-called schools tax.
The so-called schools tax, yes, as we've had it. Thank you for that question, and I'll put that to the panelists. And I knew that one was going to come up early this evening, but Aaron, will it be effective, and is it fair, I guess, to tax people in that way?
I think that what's become clear tonight is how multifaceted and complex the issue is, and I think it needs many responses. I think it's up to government to look at its policy tools, and the regulation being one of them, and I only speak for the regulation of the profession, but I think transparency in the communication is really critical in a time like this where we've seen rapid change. Now we're seeing new policy responses, and I know the profession, real estate profession's facing bigger risks because they have to learn all about this to inform their clients faster than ever. So I think being informed is important about these changes. I think this kind of dialogue is also going to continue to keep government apprised of where they should go next in the direction.
All right. Thank you, Aaron. And Tom Davidoff, I suspect you have a thing or two to say about this.
Yeah, well, I've heard a lot from people with homes over $3 million, not generally favorable about my support for increased property taxes. Obviously, there's some fairness issues. It's a significant increase. We've got very low tax rates on 0.25%, which by any standard is a low rate. And all of a sudden, if your house is $10, $15 million, you're getting close to 0.65%. So that's a big increase all at once. So you could think about phase in. Fortunately, a lot of these people are over 55 and can defer, so it just comes out at the end. So the timing is interesting, but the thing I will say is if you were starting Vancouver from scratch and you thought about what kind of taxes do you want in a place where lots and lots of affluent people want to live on not enough land, of course you'd settle on higher property taxes, low income and sales taxes, and probably high taxes on luxury homes. That's not where we started, so any transition will, of course, be painful.
And we see that, and you've said that often, we see that Vancouver's property taxes are substantially less, far, far less than other major cities in North America, and yet we don't see any appetite at all to adjust it. But I guess, Tung, is this the way to go to I don't know, does this bring fairness, or is this unfair to people who, you know, through no fault of their own, happen to find themselves in a $3 million house?
On a broader principle, any time when the government wants to tax asset, wealth, rather than income, there's going to be a problem. The provincial government years back introduced this capital tax on corporations, and they don't look at income. They just said, if you have capital, we'll tax you, whether you make money or not, we'll tax you. Guess what? They rolled it back. They eliminated it. So this is the same situation here. People are sitting on wealth. They are not sitting on income. You cannot easily convert those into money that you can actually pay out. So whether fair or not is a different discussion altogether.
Right.
But we don't tax, we shouldn't, unless when people sell the house or when they pass on as an estate. If you want to do that, that's people, you can understand that. People say, oh yeah, okay, when I died, I passed on my estate, tax me, fine, it's not my problem, someone else's problem.
I want to get back to the questions, and Trevina Lee from Fairchild Radio has a question for us from Facebook right now.
Yeah, I have George asking on YouTube. He wants he'd like to know what is the definition of affordable housing. He said, whatever the bar is, it feels skewed.
All right. This is a question that we hear a lot, which is the definition of affordable housing. Erin, would you like to take a crack at that?
I think that it's different for different people. I think it's a very difficult policy piece for the government to set, and I think it's always changing. And as we've seen in the last few years where property valuations go up 6-7%, when you've got that kind of rapid growth, it quickly escalates and changes what affordability means. We still banter about the 1/3 of your income, and we all know now in the Lower Mainland that that's no longer holding. So I think it's an important moving bar to keep talking about, and to look at, again, all of the different policy responses for how affordability can be managed within that.
Yeah, and I think obviously it's ever changing, and it's a relative thing. But Tom, last week I was looking at a statistic that said that in, I believe it was 1996, it would cost you about 7.8%. Your income would be about, or the cost of a median house was 7.8% times the median income. By 2016, that number had risen to something like 25 or 26%. So the relative affordability is a problem, obviously.
It is, along with my wife, who some people know is a constituency assistant to David Eby, we looked at some data, and we found that if you line up the houses on the west side of Vancouver from the worst house to the best house, and line up married couples with children in Vancouver from the lowest income to the highest income, the worst house on the west side would be affordable to something like 5% of married couples, and it just goes downhill from there.
But how do you determine what's affordable? How do you define it as affordable?
Well, that's based on the CMHC stress test. So take a 20% down payment and see how big of a house you can buy based on today's interest rate plus about 2%. And you get very, very few people can afford, certainly detached houses. Of course, it gets a little bit better when you go to other neighborhoods and townhomes or apartments.
Tung Chan, what's your definition of affordability?
There's all kinds of definitions. If you look at from a banker's perspective, they look at how much your income is going to go towards housing. And that's including mortgages as well as the condominium fees and all of those other things. And beyond that, we wouldn't qualify for a mortgage. Now, that's that banker's perspective. If you look at social housing, when you provide social housing, CMHC actually have a formula. Very complicated. Look at your income, look at all those other things, and they come up and they change over time. The government reporting has another different income. But for every person, simply is if you can give me a house where I can live on, and after I pay my mortgages and operating costs, I still have money to raise my kid for my transportation. That's affordable. So there's totally different definition. But one thing I forgot to mention in my introduction, and that is the role played by public transit in all this housing issue. We haven't talked about it. If we have good public transit, where people in Surrey can move to work in the Richmond, Vancouver airport, or go to school who live out in Chilliwack, then we won't have as much of a pressure on the housing market. We don't. Look at the inability and the failure of the government to make sure we have good public transit. It's the government policymakers fail us.
And yet we heard this week from opponents of the density that will come along with public transit in certain parts of the city.
Yeah.
Excuse me, we'll go to another audience question here. Yes.
My name is Elaine Beltran-Salidi. I'm a resident here of Richmond. I am an early childhood educator, and I work with the post-educating students that will become educators later. I just have a question in terms of children's rights. It seems that the new norm now is to talk about apartment living for young children. And I would like to question that. Are apartments, the way they stand at the moment, the way apartment buildings and complexes are built, are they adequate for children? Do they honor children's rights for good housing, to move their body, to be loud, to make friends? So what I'd like to ask is if you know if there are any efforts being made to consider children's rights for housing which honor their ways of being in the world. So green spaces, communal areas, spaces to develop friendships. In Richmond alone, in a neighborhood where I live, the school is losing children, right? Because people cannot live there. So where are children going to live? What are their rights for good housing?
Thank you for that question. And it's certainly a consideration we've heard when we hear cities talking about building affordable family housing. Erin, is there something that you'd like to add to that? Is there a place for children? Is that actually a consideration when we're talking about building affordable housing?
I think it's exciting to think about how planning is changing quickly to adapt to the demands that the public has for housing. And I think it's fairly new that families have been now expecting that they're going to live in multi-unit dwellings. I think we're seeing very creative planning and zoning emerging. Are we there yet? No. And I think children's rights are part of that. I think communal space, living seniors with young people and having more space for collaboration of different ages and different groups of people is important, but we're not there. And I think we have to be supporting and pushing for more rapid change to respond to that.
Thank you. And Tom, when we talk about additional density, and of course we have a lot of people who are in favor of that, but are there the amenities to go along with it? If you're going to bring a child into a one-bedroom or a two-bedroom condominium, is there going to be a school? Is there going to be adequate green space across the street or recreational facilities?
Well, what blows me away is you'll go to a place like Langley or here even in Richmond and you see all kinds of new dense housing going up. But the west side of Vancouver, I guess the east side as well, you have schools emptying out where you've got great parks, great amenities, and single-family home is simply not an option for working families with children. Townhomes, three-bedroom apartments, if you let the market build lots of density on the west side, eventually they're going to run out of demand for small one-bedroom, two-bedrooms. There's lots of demand today, but eventually you run out and you're going to have to start building 2 and 3 bedrooms, maybe you mandate townhome. But let's get our very well-endowed areas with some family-friendly housing, absolutely.
All right, and Tung?
I think that's a very, very good question. And children is our future. We've got to make sure that they have good space to live and to play and to grow up. Fantastic, that's good. We got to all do that. My answer for you though is let's take a look at other international cities like we are. There's no way about getting away from it. So look at Paris, how did they do it? Look at New York, how did they do it? Look at London, how did they do it? Look at San Francisco, how did they do it? And learn from them because we want to live in the international city. Learn from the international cities. But more importantly though, I think it's so important is that people will adjust the behavior. I still remember Yale Town, when it was first designed and built. Councilors thought that, and the planner thought no one with the children would live in there. A child would live in there. Guess what? Many children living in there. There's not enough school for them. It is because, again, it's our failure of our planners and our policymakers in anticipating what is needed. We need to have complex solution to a complex issue, not a single issue, not a single, simple silver bullet to solve that.
Thank you, Tung. And Trevina Lee from Fairchild Radio has another question for us from Facebook.
Hi, Stephen, I have a comment on Facebook. Kirk says, the higher-end houses of $1 million plus don't help anyone getting into the markets. He asks, what can be done about the condo market, which is continuing to grow beyond absurdity?
All right, thank you for that. Who wants to tackle that? Is the condo market, Tom Davidoff, growing beyond absurdity?
Condo prices have gotten very high. You know, something I hear in social media a lot is don't build condos. They're just going to go to rich foreign speculator flippers. So there's no point. It doesn't create affordability. That's where I think tax policy and zoning policy go hand in hand. Because when it becomes completely unaffordable from a tax perspective now to be a foreign buyer of an empty unit in the city of Vancouver, you're looking at a 3% bill a year if you can't get around the upfront tax of 20%. Even if you do it, you're doing a huge favor to the government by providing a ton of money that can go to affordable housing, but more likely than not, you're not. And that you're not going to do it. You don't get rich paying 20% upfront and 3% a year. And so now, with better tax policy in place, you get to a place where I think we can all agree building housing for locals can improve affordability.
Tung?
I think here is where I'm a slightly different from opinion with a professor here. If we look at housing as a right, which I believe in it, and we all in our heart believe that is the case, then I think the government has to insert itself more forcefully. You look at the other cities around the world, it's the government that produced the affordable housing units. It's the government who designed those policies. And we have perfect policy instruments. We have CMHC, but guess what? They have not been in housing building business for a long, long time. We have BC Housing. What have they done in terms of creating more affordable housing? They have done touch in the margin. The city has recently said they're going to create about 1,000 affordable rental units. Is that enough? No, sir, it's not enough. We got to do it on a massive basis, targeted, providing affordable rental units to our citizens.
I want to jump ahead to my colleague, Michelle Elliott. Thank you, Tom. My colleague, Michelle Elliott, the host of BC Today, province-wide on CBC Radio 1. And who have you got with you there, Michelle?
Yes, Stephen, I'm joined by Matt Pitcairn, who's the president and CEO of the Richmond Chamber of Commerce. Good evening, Matt.
No, thank you very much.
When you hear from your members, what do they tell you, what do they see as the need when it comes to housing?
So we know that from our members, housing unaffordability here in Richmond is a major challenge. We did a survey recently, and about 65% of our members reported that it was causing massive issues as far as retention and recruitment of new employees. And we also know that we're seeing more than the majority of our members' workforce is now commuting from outside of Richmond to work every single day. And to the point raised earlier about transportation, we know it's very challenging in this region, this city, on our roadways to move not only people but goods. And so they're finding it harder and harder to commute, and many of them are taking a smaller wage closer to home to avoid making that commute on a daily basis.
And so what do you see as the role of the business community then when it comes to alleviating that?
I think we need to act with a sense of urgency. We need to be working at all levels of government. We need our local developers, working with City Hall, working with the province to get the type of supply that meets families' needs, employers' needs, and gets on the market as soon as possible.
And so how far do you have to go then when it comes to increasing that supply if you look at Richmond?
Well, I think what we need, and a few comments have been raised earlier. I think the woman before me who mentioned the comment about families, and how do we build the right type of space for families to raise their kids that have children that are in local schools. We need to be building the right kind of supply. 1 and 2 bedrooms, that's not where someone's going to raise a family and send their kids to the school down the street. So that's why it's important for that partnership. What is the type of supply? What are the type of homes that are going to build community? And those require partnerships, and we need those desperately and urgently and immediately.
Matt, thanks for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
That is Matt Pitcairn, who's the president and CEO of the Richmond Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you, Michelle. Michelle Elliott, the host of BC Today on CBC Radio 1, province-wide every weekday. Well, while Michelle was talking, we have disappeared our last panel. Erin Seeley, Tom Davidoff, and Tung Chan. Thank you both very much thank you all of you rather, very much for your participation this evening. It's greatly appreciated. We have quietly replaced them with a brand new panel. And by the way, I'm Stephen Quinn, and you're listening to a town hall on housing live from Richmond on CBC Radio 1. Our Fairchild Radio colleagues are here. Trevina Lee is here. And we've been reconstituting our panel for, the end of tonight's discussion, or the next part of tonight's discussion. If I could ask our panelists to please do what they've all done, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you think about the key question that we began with this evening, about whether housing is a human right or an investment.
Thank you, Stephen. My name's John Stavella. I'm a developer. I was born and raised in Vancouver. We do a lot of office, strata residential, and a lot of rental residential development throughout the region, including Victoria. Mm-hmm. And very interested and involved in the industry and how to deal with all these issues of affordability. As to the question about whether housing is a human right or an investment, I think it's both. I think our government already has imperfect but well-intentioned programs to make sure that everybody has a place to live. Even I can think we own an SRO in Victoria, which we partner with a nonprofit, slightly supported by the City of Victoria, and we rent 62 rooms at welfare rates to that nonprofit for $0 a month. And we rely on the retail rent from the building below. So corporations can participate in creating that human right as well. But I think it's also an investment. If you do have means, our government has long recognized that formulation of a household is a tax-exempt investment, because people need a place to raise their family, and they pay off that home and they work and they build up some retirement savings. We don't have pensions anymore, so for a lot of us, our home is our pension. So I think it's both.
I want to circle back to you, John, but I do want to change up the question a little bit as we go through our last half hour here tonight and ask, how do we get out of this mess?
Thank you, Stephen. My name is May So, and I'm an architect with Henriquez Partners Architects. And one of the central questions that I think our work tries to ask is really how do we use the private sector and the flow of capital and direct it towards social good. And so I think to answer your question in terms of solutions, I think one of the biggest things that we've worked with is just collaboration with different stakeholders, including the government, the province, with business improvement associations, and with the users themselves to try and address both the commoditization of housing as well as the need for housing, and try to figure out how we can address both.
All right, thank you, May.
Yeah, hi, I'm Josh Gordon. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Public Policy. The problem in Vancouver, it's not the only problem, but the main problem in my view is that we have a housing market that's decoupled from the labor market. And it's decoupled from the labor market because we make it a fantastic situation for people to bring overseas wealth here, and enjoy all the amenities and social services that Canadian society provides, and pay the low cost of property taxes. And they can enjoy all those different things, and they can take advantage of the services that are being paid for by the local working population. And so it means that the local working population is put at a significant or serious disadvantage. And if you want to think about this, you can think about two sets of people competing for a $1 million property. If you are working in the local labor market, you need to make about $200,000, which means you're having to pay about $65,000 in income taxes every year. If you bring foreign funds, then you don't need to pay any income taxes. So that means that every single year you're put at a $65,000 disadvantage, and that accumulates over time. And so it's no surprise that all the expensive property, or the vast majority of the expensive property, is being bought by people who aren't making a living here. And so that's the fundamental problem. We need to address it, and the spec tax does that, and so we need to go forward with that.
Thank you, Josh. And finally.
Hi, Stephen. My name is Kira Gerwing. I'm a manager of community investment at Van City, and I've noticed that the conversation tonight has really been sort of couched in the dominant economic paradigm. But what the credit union offers is actually a different economic paradigm to think about the whole housing delivery system, and that's actually the cooperative economy. The first panel tonight talked a little bit about sharing. The credit union has almost 530,000 members living here in the Lower Mainland. We've all pooled our capital and we're reinvesting it back into our community. And one of the ways that we do that is by investing in social purpose real estate or community-owned real estate assets. So I've been thinking about the pastor's story about this church. And there's a really interesting opportunity. There's a significant number of community-owned real estate assets in our communities. Churches, not-for-profits, legions, school boards, etc. It would be a really amazing opportunity if the investment that was coming from funds raised through these various tax measures and some of the additional capital that's finally coming back from the federal government to actually empower the not-for-profit sector to develop its own real estate in ways like what the pastor described earlier tonight. And the reason why that's important, Stephen, is because it puts people before profits. And that is a principle underpinning the cooperative economy. It's a principle that Van City is promoting, and we've got a bit of a groundswell.
Thank you so much, Kira. John Stovall, I want to give you a brief crack at this as well, because I changed the question halfway through there, but I do want to know how you would see us getting out of this mess.
Well, lots of people have talked about the applicability of taxes tonight and other issues around demand side measures such as taxes. That's been well discussed. I personally disagree with those taxes, but I'd like to focus more on talking about supply and also getting permits. Like as an example, this is a real world story from my life today. I met with the most senior planning official of a major municipality in the region about a site on a massive transportation corridor. And I have 500 rental units coming to that site, trying to get onto that site, of which 25% are 2 or 3 bedroom units and probably about 10% are 3 bedroom units, family units. And I was told by those officials that they would like me to wait for another 2 years while they think about that policy area. Why don't you wait for 2 more years while we starting to think about having a plan for that area that has had transit on it for decades? And I'm going, well, that makes no sense. At the high level, at the mayor, you're saying we need rental housing, but there you are, with 500 rental units, and they're saying, can't you wait 2 more years? We haven't done our work yet. So we've got to look at how government regulations, overly cautious approaches to zoning, are suppressing very valuable land from being pushed into use by the population at large.
Thank you so much, John. Appreciate it.
So
let's get to
getting out of it means fixing the land.
All right. Thank you, John. And we've got another question from the audience.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Karen McKay. I've got a question specifically about developers and realtors. So what is being done about pre-sale investment where homes are being sold prior to going on sale to the public? So I've seen this firsthand where specifically a developer is doing a pre-sale. In a pre-sale environment, a realtor comes in with 60 investors. That's all they are as investors, and they purchase basically before any of the public can purchase. So who holds the developer and the realtor accountable for taking away the supply for your average person? And also what I know firsthand, what happens is that once the developer realizes there's so much interest in their property, prior to going on sale, they'll jack the prices up. So affordability is an issue and availability is a huge issue.
All right. John Stovall, would you like to tackle that one? You're the only developer up here.
Well, I mean, first of all, I've never sold anything to anybody who isn't a member of the public. Everybody's a member of the public. Are they an investor? Maybe they have an intention to invest. One of the things a lot of people don't understand about large condominium development is the banks, in order to build a building, a big condominium building, you have to get pre-sales, or the bank won't lend you the money to build the building. So developers do work with realtors who have a proven track record. of bringing buyers to the table, because everybody gets 7 days to change their mind. So developers will bring and work with realtors who have a proven track record of bringing serious buyers who won't rescind their contracts, give the developer a base of sales that they can start to get towards their pre-sale contract requirements of the bank. And another thing a lot of people don't know about, and we talk about foreign buyers, is banks also control how many foreign buyers you can have. If you sell to too many foreign buyers, the bank won't lend you the money. Recent project that we did in downtown Vancouver, we have about 11% foreign buyers.
But have you ever seen a situation as described there, where you have a realtor come with representing a group of investors saying, we'd like to buy a whole bunch of units here? And
well, you're again back to the banks. The banks won't let any one buyer buy more than 2, possibly 3 units.
Right.
So a realtor will bring. On a project that we sold, a realtor brought 100 buyers. So, and those are buyers who have a track record of not rescinding on their contracts. So they're all members of the public. They're all people who they may have an intention to invest. Maybe later they're going to live it. Maybe they're going to retire. Maybe they're going to rent. They're all members of the public, and they're all just the people who are stepping up and making the commitment.
But they're buying them as investments, not as a place they intend to live. Obviously.
You don't they may want to invest. They may want to sell it later. They may rent it. They may assign it before it completes. All of this is completely legal, and it's a long tradition in our industry of how it works.
And what does it do to prices?
It doesn't do anything to prices.
Really?
You can't.
That kind of.
Stephen.
That kind of demand.
Sell me this bottle of water for $1 right now. I'm going to send it to that guy for $2. Are you kidding? He's only going to.
Depends on how thirsty he is.
He's only going to buy it for $2 if there's no more water.
How thirsty is he?
There's no land. There's nothing. Find the inventory. Where's the inventory? There's no inventory anywhere.
We're going to go over to Trevina Lee from Fairchild Radio right now. And Trevina, who have you got with you there?
I'm here with Carrie Starchuk, community activist in Richmond. Good evening, Carrie. Carrie has been living in Richmond since 1957. She's a long-term resident here. Other countries have banned foreign investment in housing. Do you agree this is the right way to go? And if so, why is there such a resistance here in Canada?
That's what I want to ask the panel, why we're resistant against banning foreign investment. My son lives in Australia, and you can't buy older stock property, but you can buy new property. And I did do an interview with SBS Dateline Australia when they came to Richmond, and they went, wow, you've got really different problems here. Why aren't you doing what Australia's doing? So.
All right, we'll put that to the panel. I don't know that everyone would describe it as a problem, but who would like to take a crack at that one first? Josh Gordon.
Sure, of course. A few points on that. First of all, the public is on board with what you're saying. The foreign buyer tax had about 90% support. I'm a political scientist. Most policies don't tend to get 90% support. That's kind of the first time I've ever seen that. So there's clearly an appetite for those types of policy measures, and it's frustration on the part of locals who feel like the game is rigged, and that's part of how the frustrations arise around kind of buying pre-sale condos and all the games that are played there kind of percolate in the public discourse. And so, I think that fundamentally government needs to reconnect, again, the housing market to the local labor market, make sure that people who are working here, who are living here, that they have a fair shot, that they're put on a level playing field, and that everybody pays their fair share.
But do you worry that level of public support for keeping foreign investors out of, whether it's Australia or New Zealand or anybody else who has tried to do this, is built on, in some part anyhow, on xenophobia, on racism, on we don't want those people in our country buying stuff up?
There may be some of that, but the interesting thing is, first of all, 90% support would suggest that there would be a lot of xenophobes in Vancouver, and I don't think that really matches up. If you also look at the polling, you see support across all ethnic groups at about 90% support. It is even. So this idea that this is fully dividing communities and all this different stuff, that's overplayed. People in Vancouver are frustrated. They're fed up with what's going on. They don't want it to continue, and this cuts across ethnicity. It cuts across class because they see what's going on is wrong.
Anyone else want to jump in? Ban on foreign investment?
I guess I guess what I would say, Stephen, is that you know, there's sort of the hammer way of going about it, and then there's the way of painting alternative possibilities that demonstrate what happens when you actually reinvest capital back into your own community. And I think we've got some really great examples from actually the credit union to show how when you pool local capital, you can deliver on projects that meet community needs, that don't have all of these kind of squirrely sales transactions going on that people you know, kind of hear about and speculate and wonder about, but they're actually demonstrating the successful way that if you flow local capital into local projects, you can meet local needs. That's a real opportunity.
Thank you, Kira. Meso, banning foreign investment.
That's a really good question. I think that I agree with here. Instead of, you know, trying to ban a certain something, I think it's about creating alternatives and a wider spectrum of choices for people. So I think, you know, over the years we've started building more like purpose-built housing. So we worked with Van City to create 60 West Cordova, which is like specifically for, it's had some mixed success, but, you know, in terms of at least trying to target a very local downtown east side kind of residents and workers, as well as we've started building more like rental, purpose-built rental, which is a little bit more affordable than home ownership. So we're not, you know, I think we're more for kind of using the capital towards building something for, you know, kind of other aspects of like just all the different wide spectrum that's required for housing.
John, I want to get to the audience member next, but could you just give me like three words on banning foreign investment?
Don't do it.
Don't do it.
That's 3 words.
There you go. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hello, thank you. My name is Eugene Ip. I live in the city of Burnaby. Housing is much more than a brick and mortar consideration. Accessible, affordable housing is a vital determinant of good private and community life. I want my question continues to take the discourse from talking housing as in the private realm into the community realm here. A sad part of today's housing issue is real estate pursuits have seriously disconnected with housing and community building. This is not much more an issue when real estate is so bound up with inter-ethnic relations, overseas monies, and speculative profit making.
Is there a question here, sir?
What in your view needs to happen to not further lose the connection between real estate market activities and sustenance of local community life quality?
That's a very good question.
You.
Thank you very much. Gee, I don't know. Kira Gerwing. Van City Community Investment. Would you like to go ahead with that?
Yeah, I think that you know, earlier we were talking about what kind of policy solutions could be there. Often that becomes a question about how do you flow funding from government. I actually think there's some other very interesting policy tools that different levels of government could entertain. One is that all real estate that is currently owned by community-based organizations stays in community hands, so that these really weird deals between market developers and some of the faith-based organizations that we've seen come out of the ground over the last couple of years actually stop. And that all of the wealth that gets generated from developing a community-owned real estate assets actually gets reinvested back into that community. That's not what happens when private market developers and churches, in some cases, get together and broker deals. So I think that, that's one example. It takes a certain level of sophistication around the kind of math that a market developer does versus the way that a city measures that math versus what a nonprofit could generate from that same kind of math.
Yeah, but do they have to be mutually exclusive? Is it not possible, John Stovall, for a market-based developer to build something that contributes to community?
Sure. You know, there's a new West End plan downtown Vancouver where when you build a new residential tower, you have to create 20% of the units for non-market housing, and you actually have to give that entire parcel of land, the land under it, the building, and drop the keys in the hands of the city, who will turn it over to a nonprofit, who will operate it for entry-level housing or co-op or even welfare level housing.
The cost of doing that gets borne by the buyers of the other units in that building.
So they're making their contribution.
Josh?
What I would say on the front of community and housing is that the current policy framework is broken. The status quo is broken. They did a survey of reported self-life satisfaction, and Vancouver was the lowest in urban Canada. And we are surrounded by beauty. So that is a massive public policy failure. And part of the problem is that housing is so expensive. And so, and also if you're working locally, you're having a really hard time buying it. And so debt and stress is placed on your shoulders. For those who don't have a lot of means, renters especially, you have the danger of being rent-evicted and so on. And so there's a lot of stress at that side of the market. And the flip side is that a lot of people are doing fantastically well. But those people are often well off to begin with. And so that's a recipe for an unhappy society and a recipe for breaking down the community bonds. And it creates angry, divisive politics, which is what we're starting to see, which is really unfortunate. And again, that's why we need to fix the housing market.
I also think that different parties, what we found is different parties bring different strengths to a development project. And so, for example, our Central Presbyterian Church development in the West End is a perfect example of where a church wanted to redevelop their land, and so they're actually co-developing it with a developer. And so the developer brings the expertise and the efficiencies of the development kind of market, but then also the church kind of keeps their interest in it as well. So there's a true partnership there.
Kira, is this one of the weird deals with faith-based organizations that you alluded to a moment ago?
I would say so, because the amount of wealth that gets generated from a project like that doesn't actually get evenly distributed between the two partners. Right? The risk-reward metrics are off kilter.
Let's leave that there if we can, because Michelle Elliott is back at the microphone, and she's got a question from Facebook.
Yes, Stephen, we have a question from Shelley, who writes, how important is the housing crisis going to be in Vancouver's municipal election? What impact might it have?
Well then, let's go there now, shall we? You want to flip a coin and see who goes first on that one? Is it though? I mean, we do see this at the municipal level as well. We've seen efforts from the City of Vancouver, whether it's the empty homes tax or trying to crack down on Airbnbs, trying to make more of those empty condos available. We've got the concerted effort by the provincial government. John, how do you think all of this is going to play out in the upcoming elections? Not in Vancouver, right across the Lower Mainland.
I think it's going to be the only issue in just about every municipality. Burnaby, Surrey, Vancouver, North Vancouver, West Vancouver, less so. I think it's going to be the issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if you were a politician, and I know you're not, but if you were a politician and you wanted to get reelected this November, what would you be telling people? What would you be saying to people about housing?
Nothing.
You wouldn't talk about it at all.
It's a tough one. You know, I mean, what our industry's been advocating for a long time is that senior government, federal government, and provincial government need to both mandate and support local governments in creating more housing opportunities and rezoning and zoning more land so there's more supply and more housing choices. And unfortunately, consultative processes we've developed and the razor-thin margins and low voter turnout in municipal elections mean that municipal politicians are very nervous to make bold moves, and I can hardly blame them. So government across the full three levels of government needs to bear down on this.
All right, thank you. And Josh?
I think it's definitely going to be the number one issue. What's interesting is that normally, again, from the political science literature, when there are lots of jobs, incumbent politicians usually get reelected. But there are a lot of politicians, incumbent politicians, that might be concerned right now. And as we saw, Mayor Gregor Robertson didn't run again. And that's because of this anger over housing. And so clearly it's a central issue. And there is a great deal of support for what the NDP has done. And I think the NDP and the Green Party, in support of them, have done a bunch of good things. And if I was a local politician, I would be in support of those measures, because those are the most important measures.
All right, I'm going to go back to another question from the audience. Yes, go ahead.
I would like to address the issue that media bias play in this entire housing saga. For one thing, I seldom notice or observe any mention of the people, those seniors or baby boomers or whoever who sold and made huge fortune in this housing crisis, but maybe because their names are not with the Asian last name, they never got mentioned. Mm-hmm. And in this entire crisis, it seems like there's only one demon, that's foreign investor, which is not true. Housing issue is an incredibly complicated issue. You have long-term low interest rate, you have a limited land supply, you have speculators, and you have many elements into it, but the media seems to pick one and only one sassy part because they can pit on people's anger, and which is foreign investors. And actually, I should bracket it, say that it's Chinese wealthy investors, which is very unfair for the people. We live here for more than 20 years. We work 2 jobs to sustain our house, and we did so much. But how about those people, my neighbor, a Greek couple, who sold their house for millions when they bought the house, is 100,000. So these names were not mentioned by media. So I actually want to task CBC. You guys are the Crown Corporation or Special Service Agency, supposed to keep a very neutral view of the entire broadcasting and talking about these issues. You're not supposed to dance together with the paid media. Unfortunately, until now, I did my Google search and research on the CBC's news articles. I haven't seen any one single story about the people who happily ever retire, move to Hawaii or move to Mexico, wherever, because they sold a house.
I want to put this, thank you very much.
That sounds like a question for you, Stephen.
No, it's an important issue, and since I'm not in the business of answering questions, only asking them, I'm going to throw it to Josh.
Okay, a couple of points here. First of all, your point about the lack of stories about the people who have cashed out, that's a fair point. One thing I will say is that, in fact, we are sitting here in 2018 having this discussion. We did not have this discussion in 2011. We did not have this discussion in 2005. And part of the reason was that there was fear about all these different tensions and so on and so forth. And so we didn't deal with the problem sooner. The second thing I want to say is that, just to be very clear here, this is not about vilification about anybody. I understand that sometimes happens, and that's problematic, and that should be called out every time it happens. What we're talking about here is fixing a problematic or faulty policy framework. Okay? That is fundamentally what it's about. It's understanding how we got here and fixing the policy framework so that moving forward we don't have the types of tensions that are arising sometimes today.
John? Do you want to take a crack at it? We'll go to you in a moment, May.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like it's such an easy thing to sort of blame the visible minority. There's a long tradition in all social tensions of singling out visible minorities, whatever the problem is, and it just makes me so sad. I just think what we should be doing is, I mean, there's so many cities and countries in the world that would welcome investment. I think what we need to do is find out a way to take this incredible desirability of our city and the fact that we're on the global stage and that people from all over the world, from all cultures, want to come here. And the last thing we should be doing is beating up on them. We should be finding a way to welcome their investment and all benefit from it. And instead of always writing about how foreign investment is what's behind all of this. What's really behind all of this, in my view, and of course it's, I suppose, what people always say, I'm going to say, is there's just more demand than supply. We've got immigration vastly exceeding the number of houses we're building in in Canada's major cities, and people are coming to the major cities. We've got foreign students that we're welcoming. We've got household formation with millennials. We have people moving from urban or rural to urban areas. And so we just don't have enough, and that's what we got to do. We got to build more.
May?
Yeah, and I think, you know, what we struggle with most is not so much foreign investment as much as just the kind of just capital flows, which wherever they're coming from, and that could be foreign investment, it could be the next source could be Amazon, it could be many different things. And so what we're trying to understand is how to harness that and how to create a space for everybody to live in the city, including middle-income people and low-income people. And so I think for us, on a day-to-day basis as architects, we work a lot with understanding policy and trying to figure out how we can increase the amount of middle and lower income housing in our projects.
Kira, literally like 20 seconds left here.
Yeah, I totally agree with May. It's about the flow of capital, but it's not just the flow of capital into the city, it's actually how that capital flows through the corporate structures or the cooperative structures that actually makes the big difference about how you can serve a community.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate you being here this evening. Really appreciate all of your thoughtful comments. John Stovall, May So, Josh Gordon, Kira Gerwing as well. A big thanks to all of you who came here this evening to pose your questions. I know we've still got a lot that we didn't get to, but we will continue this conversation right across CBC Radio 1 on pretty much all of our programs, and we do appreciate everything you've had to say tonight and all of your input. To our panelists and invited guests, all of the panelists who stuck around, thank you for your expertise and your time. And Fairchild Radio's Trevina Lee and the Fairchild team, thank you so much. We appreciate all of your work as well. My CBC colleague, BC Today host Michelle Elliott, thank you to you. And thanks to everyone behind the scene here, our technical crew and the producers and everybody who put this together. It really was a big effort. Thanks to the pastor as well, Pastor Stuart Appenheimer, for hosting us here this evening. The conversation does not end here. We are going to be releasing audio from tonight's broadcast in a future episode of the CBC Vancouver original podcast called Sold. You'll be able to download it shortly at cbc.ca/podcasts or on iTunes. And our Fairchild colleagues as well will be airing some of tonight's show on their airwaves as well. For everyone who put the program together, for Fairchild